Okay, virtual people, can you hear me? Okay. Excellent. Oops. All right, well, I think that is everybody who's going to be joining us in person today. Get started. Does anyone need anything before we start? Bathroom, whatever? Great. Awesome. So for those of you who maybe virtually, who don't know me, or in person who don't know me that well, I'm Dagny Deutschman. And for the past couple of years, I've been looking at this project about how mindfulness, self-compassion relate to sleep across the week, specifically looking through association with pre-sleep arousal. And as we begin this, I'm just actually going to have us all kind of ground into the space together. So if everyone just kind of wants to let themselves get comfortable, feel your feet on the floor, relax into your chair a little bit. Virtual people too, if that feels good to you. If it doesn't feel good to close your eyes, I would just maybe direct you to being intentionally fidgety with one object, maybe a texture on your pants or the feel of your own hands. And as you're dropping into yourself in this space, just go ahead and notice your breath. Notice whatever it is that you notice. Seeing if you can call attention to maybe where your gravity is pooling in some parts of your body more than others. And if it feels good and accessible, I'm just going to ask everyone on their next exhale to just empty their lungs all the way out of your air. We're all going to breathe in together. In, 2, 3, 4, and hold. 2, 3, 4, and exhale. And in your own time, just go ahead and open your eyes and come back to this space. I just like to start this way because I think whatever is going on in our lives, this just brings us back into this room. And I'm really excited to share this science. So I need it just as much as you do to kind of keep my nerves about me. Before we begin, I want to just do a little bit of a land and cultural acknowledgement. So I want to make sure that we acknowledge the lands, the unceded lands of the tribal communities that we're on. And then also a cultural acknowledgement, because a lot of the pieces that I'm interested in and looking at were taken, although mindfulness and self-compassion are components that have been omnipresent in all cultures and all religions and all traditions, the way that psychology specifically has studied them was taking them from the Buddhist context, studying them from that way. And then sometimes that gets taken out of its culturally appropriate context. And so we lose certain pieces of that. So just wanting to name that, and maybe during questions, we can tie some of those pieces back in. But for the rest of this particular presentation, we're going to be talking about them from the secularized Western standard of them. Personal acknowledgements. I just want to thank everybody on my committee who's helped me throughout this whole process. Definitely friends and family. You all have held many tears throughout this process. And very specifically, I wanted to thank Dr. Jennifer McCullen and Dr. Susanna Powell. They were incredible peers throughout this entire progress. And then, of course, my lab, who did so much research for me. So just a little bit of an introduction. College students, 60% of college students are not getting adequate sleep. We know that sleep relates very strongly to a lot of different well-being factors. So kind of overall well-being, social interactions, academic success, and then also psychopathology symptoms like anxiety, depression, and then suicidal behaviors. We know that from the body of literature that things like mindfulness, self-compassion, and pre-sleep arousal do already associate kind of together. Specifically, we're looking here, though, to see if pre-sleep arousal, mindfulness, and self-compassion all relate in a very specific pattern, which is that is the reason that mindfulness and self-compassion are affecting sleep outcomes or related to sleep outcomes because of some amount of relationship with pre-sleep arousal. We didn't find any expected associations. We'll talk about that a little bit in more depth. but I just want to give a brief overview so we're all talking about the same things. So when we're looking at mindfulness and self-compassion, the way that Westernized science recognizes mindfulness is with 4 major components. We're looking at flexible regulation of attention, objective receptivity, awareness and acceptance of the experiences, and then orientation to the here and now. When we're looking at self-compassion, we're looking at 3 kind of distinct categories that are both split off into 2. So these are things like, if you think of these as opposites of the same construct. So we have self-kindness versus self-judgment, human connection versus isolation, and then mindfulness versus over-identification. What is sleep? We could actually spend like years and years and years talking about this, as it turns out, but for the purposes of today, we're just going to talk about a little, some brief components about sleep. Sleep in general is 2 very independent processes that drive us to go from a wakeful state into a sleep state. Process S, or is sometimes known as homeostatic pressure, which is basically saying that the longer you've been awake, the more likely it is that you will need to sleep soon. And then there's this other distinct process, which is your process C, or your circadian rhythm, which says at certain times of the day, you will just naturally feel more sleepy. And for us, because we're not nocturnal animals, that typically happens for us at night. I'm interested in framing all of this work in a positive psychology framework. And so typically in psychology, we look at like what's wrong with us, how do we fix it? But in a positive psychology framework, we're looking at what is the optimal place that we're trying to get to. So I was wanting to look at this through the idea of sleep health. So in 2014, Busey coined the term sleep health, and he said that there were about 6 major pieces that we should be looking at to make sure that someone's getting adequate sleep. Sleep satisfaction, sleep duration, sleep continuity, daytime sleepiness or daytime alertness, depending on the framing, sleep timing, and sleep regularity. Oh, and sleep satisfaction, I missed one. And so pre-sleep arousal, how this all relates to it, is basically this idea that if this is our basic sleep cycle across the course of a night for a healthy adult, you can see that we go through these different stages. So we go from wakefulness into our non-REM stages and then back up to our REM stages here. And that changes in different proportions throughout the night. If we're looking at pre-sleep arousal, we get through the projector light here. I'm most interested in this phase right here, where we're on our way to bed and we're moving from wakefulness into non-REM stage 1. I'm curious about what can help facilitate that better, or maybe what might be stunting that. And pre-sleep arousal is one of those things. So the actual theory is called the hyperarousal theory of insomnia, right? But because I'm trying to frame everything in a positive psychology way, I just kind of tweaked the words a little bit. But the hyperarousal theory of insomnia posits that there's 2 major things that are inhibiting us from going from this wakeful state into this non-REM stage 1. And one of those things is that we have some kind of inappropriate physiological arousal, right? And that can happen from a variety of reasons. Maybe we ate a heavy meal, maybe we got into an argument with a partner and that kind of like stirred some stuff up in our body. Maybe we exercised too close to bed, maybe we're just particularly stressed out. And then the second phase of that is that we have some kind of psychological interpretation of the physiological changes going on in our body. So then on top of being like, oh my gosh, I'm so full, I'm so uncomfortable, then maybe there's this glance at the clock that then goes, and now I'm never going to be able to go to sleep. And then that in turn creates sort of this vicious cycle that perhaps keeps us awake longer than we need to be. And so as I was taking all these different components and just being curious about it, I started to think about how did they go together? And I began to dive into the research. The mindfulness body of research is a little bit more robust, but it's less clean. So mindfulness, sleep, and pre-sleep arousal has a lot of associative research. We know that mindfulness is associated with things like better subjective sleep, less daytime sleepiness, decreased pre-sleep arousal, and decreased wake after sleep onset. We also know that with actual experimental trials that we do see that mindfulness actually has this cause and effect of having better subjective sleep quality, fewer sleep disturbances, and decreased pre-sleep arousal. So that sort of led me to believe that like maybe there might be something to explore here. Self-compassion, on the other hand, the literature is more clean, but more sparse. So sleep and self-compassion research is really mostly looking at things that where self-compassion is some kind of a mediator or something is mediating self-compassion in sleep. So it's not as directly looked at in the literature. The only direct associative research that I found was that self-compassion associated with better subjective sleep quality, less daytime sleepiness, and then kind of these other framed things like decreased insomnia symptoms more globally, specifically falling asleep and staying asleep. So we would associate that with the objective wake after sleep onset, and decreased sleep disturbances. So I wanted to take a look at all of this, but there was some previous research limitations. First and foremost is that mindfulness and self-compassion were not studied together in any of these studies that I had looked at, or maybe one or two, which if we're thinking about the tool and implementation of mindfulness and self-compassion, the way that it's taught in a clinical setting, the way that it's practiced in a non-secular setting, these two things are actually part of the same tool. They are not things that can be taken apart. And so the fact that science is studying them as if they are separate pieces, I felt confused about. And so I wanted to have a research study that looked at these two things together. There was also mechanisms for why mindfulness and self-compassion related to sleep outcomes, but they had only been explored through rumination and perceived stress, but they had not been explored through pre-sleep arousal to this point yet. And so I know that as we're trying to figure out maybe how we make more precise interventions for sleep health, knowing every single thing that's impacting that process is an important thing. So understanding maybe how this pre-sleep arousal piece would be valuable. Also, as I was going through the research, self-compassion had no known literature with objective actigraphy data. So it was all just self-report, which is great, but imprecise. And so I was curious to see what would come of maybe looking at this with just a little bit more precision, or with some, biomedical markers. And then both mindfulness and self-compassion had been studied through trait levels, but not state levels. So trait levels meaning someone's like how much mindfulness do they have on the whole as a person walking through their daily life? How much self-compassion does someone have on a whole throughout their daily life? Versus the state levels of how much self-compassion or mindfulness does someone have right before they go to bed? Which my hypothesis was that matters. So in this present study, it was basically the purpose of it was to fill the gaps in the literature by delineating the relationships between mindfulness, self-compassion, and sleep in college students, to examine pre-sleep arousal as another possible mechanism of mediation for that process, and then to explore a certain amount of state versus trait. What we actually did was we had 75 total participants. It was not an incredibly diverse sample. We did have a pretty good male-female split. We ended up having about a mean age of 19, and then kind of the demographic that you would expect to see in Bozeman, so predominantly white. They initially came into the lab assessment where we looked at trait mindfulness and trait self-compassion. We then sent them home with a week of data collection. So we sent them home with an actigraphy watch, and then we asked them to do sleep diaries daily, which had objective sleep diary or objective sleep data from the watch, and then state level mindfulness and state level self-compassion and pre-sleep arousal was recorded on a daily basis. And then when they would follow up, they would return the equipment, they talk about any malfunctions with it, and we would take their stuff and they would go. The measures that we specifically used, I used the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire. Of all the mindfulness questionnaires, this one seemed to make the most sense to me. It was a 39-item self-report, 5-point Likert scale. So 1 meaning never, very rarely mindful, or these statements are not very rarely true, whereas 5 would be very often true. It had a very good Cronbach's alpha of 9.11 in my sample. And it had these 5 different subcategories, so little, oh my gosh, the word is escaping me right now.
Subscale?
Yes, subscale. I'm like, why can I not think of that word all of a sudden? So when I was assessing the state level, I used 1 item from every subscale. So this is a representation of how they answered every single night, like how mindfulness are you in this particular moment. Similarly with self-compassion, this was a 26-item self-report when we were looking at that full trait level self-compassion. And then the state level, I again just took 1 item from each of those subscales. And these are the different questions that I had. It's a little bit blurry. I apologize for some of the lack of clarity with that. And this too had a fairly good Cronbach's alpha of 9.22. Pre-sleep arousal. For the particular question I was asking, I thought it would be really important to distinguish between cognitive pre-sleep arousal and somatic pre-sleep arousal, because sometimes we're maybe not as aware of what's happening in our bodies. So I split these into the 2 main subscales. So the whole entire scale has a 16-item self-report with a 5-point Likert scale. And then the first 8 items are about cognitive and the second are about somatic subscale. And the participants took this each night. And if you'll notice here, the Cronbach's alpha for the cognitive was stronger than what we had for the somatic. So kind of in alignment with what we think is that the self-report data around the cognitive is just a little bit more, maybe perhaps accurate. The way that we measured sleep health, because of the actigraphy watches that we were using, most of our measures were able to be picked up by that actigraphy data, with the exception of daytime sleepiness. We used the Karolinski sleepiness scale, and then subjective sleep quality, we just did a 3-point Likert scale on our sleep diary. To be conservative, we also took a look at these covariates. So in the body of sleep research, we also know that these things are very, very highly related to different sleep disturbances. So we also looked at biological sex, we looked at age, and then we looked at psychopathology symptoms. So we used the brief symptom inventory for that. And just as a note, because the brief symptoms inventory has somatic pieces of it, some of the question items specifically look at somatic arousal, we removed those from this study so that it wouldn't interfere with the pre-sleep arousal scale. So in general, my analytic plan was to do some data cleaning, do my preliminary analyses, look at outliers, skewness, kurtosis, et cetera, look at the bivariate correlations. And then the sort of major chunk of this study was looking at that trait level, so that more global measure of mindfulness and self-compassion. And research aims 1 through 3, which we'll break down in a second, was to just sort of answer this overall question. I used the process macro through SPSS to look at this. After we did it on a trait level, we did everything again, but using those state levels. So the person's feelings of mindfulness and self-compassion in the moment right before bed. This was all additional exploratory analyses. And then after this, we also did protocols for a false discovery rate. Just because I did so many different analyses, I wanted to make sure that I didn't get any false positives. So specifically, to break this down a little bit more, the research aims were research aim 1 was looking to replicate previous research. Was mindfulness and self-compassion reliably related to sleep outcomes? Research aim 2 was looking at, is mindfulness and self-compassion related to pre-sleep arousal? And then research aim 3 was mediation models looking at that all together. So the model looked something like this. Mindfulness, looking at it between cognitive and somatic pre-sleep arousal, and then looking at how it affects, how it related to sleep health outcomes. The results of this, in my preliminary analyses, most of the things that were missing at random were because we had malfunctions with our actigraphy watches. This trait self-compassion was like a 5.1% missingness. It was also at random. And when I looked through the data a little bit more, it looks like because the way that it was cleaned was just that every single time someone missed one question, it kicked the whole thing out. So in the future, I would shift that a little bit. This is how my bivariate correlation table went out. And at this point, it became pretty clear that I was maybe not going to find the things that I was hoping to find. But some things that we were hoping to find and expected to find was that we did reliably see that the BSI, or the psychopathology symptoms, reliably related to things like mindfulness, self-compassion, and then cognitive and somatic pre-sleep arousal, which will come into play a little later. As far as our major research aims go, so aim 1, 2, 3 in our exploratory analysis, we didn't find anything significant, which is disappointing on one level. However, it also helps us open up to a whole bunch of other questions of why didn't we find what we were expecting to find? What could possibly be going on here? So different reasons we think that maybe we didn't find this. So research aim 1 felt like something that probably should be found. The absence of pathways in this particular research aim were really contrary to the whole body of literature. The literature is a little bit mixed, but more often than not, the papers that I had read and the research that had been done had found at least somewhat reliable self-compassion and mindfulness related to sleep outcomes. Bivariate correlations revealed that trait self-compassion was associated with cognitive pre-sleep arousal, which was really exciting. But then when we accounted for other covariants like psychopathology, age, and sex, primarily psychopathology ate most of that variance up. And so what this might point to is that pre-sleep period might be more impacted by rumination, perceived stress, and worry than it would be impacted particularly by self-compassion or mindfulness relating to this particular piece. So actually, let me just go back for a second. So Because I just want to sort of reiterate, because we didn't find these researching pathways on researching 1 or 2, the mediation model just like wasn't going to come out. We need that piece to be sure that the whole model was a good fit. So after we did it with our main trait level mindfulness and self-compassion, we then moved into our state level, to which trait mindfulness and self-compassion might only be protected at certain contexts from the results that we found. So the bivariate correlations showed that state self-compassion related to cognitive pre-sleep arousal. It didn't come out in any of the mediation, the regression modeling, but perhaps this is because this was just looking at a population without any intervention, and it may be for this to actually make an impact, you have to actively engage the population with some kind of an intervention with self-compassion for this to be effective. Interestingly, as we looked at the bivariate correlations, it looks that state and trait levels of both mindfulness and self-compassion did not significantly relate to each other. And this could mean a couple things, right? This could mean that either the sub-scale items that we were using did not accurately reflect how we look at trait mindfulness and trait self-compassion globally. So maybe there was an error of some kind of measure there. However, there's some different research that's coming out that suggests that perhaps these things are completely different, related but different constructs entirely. So in a recent study, there was a state mindfulness was associated with less skin conductance at the moment of a stressor. And trait mindfulness scores did not significantly predict this physiological reactions to that stress. So we're seeing in coming research that's emerging currently that someone's global mindfulness and their state mindfulness might just be working with different mechanisms. And it doesn't mean one's not important, the other's not important, but that they are inherently different somehow. Also, it is important to think that it is possible that a momentary stress during specifically that pre-sleep period, that there might be some kind of altered mindfulness or self-compassion in that moment. If we looked further at those bivariate correlations, we demonstrated that state mindfulness and state self-compassion were negatively associated with one another, which is, again, interesting, right? Mindfulness and self-compassion might be having a moderating effect here, right? Which is saying that we need a certain threshold of one to engage the other. And so there's certain research that's been coming out pretty recently, as you can see in these coming years, that maybe in relation to trauma symptomology, there might be something else going on. And it's possible that eliciting both mindfulness and self-compassion prior to bedtime might be better sleep health outcomes as opposed to mindfulness or self-compassion in isolation or as just a general practice. So some of the major limitations of this study was that primarily COVID-19 really was happening right in the middle of this. So during my data collection happened that very, very first semester after schools opened up. So people had been in isolation, people had been in stressful situations, and then their first semester back, this was a very labor-intensive study. So we asked a lot of our research participants to do this. We know that COVID-19 impacted overall sleep health for everyone, and we know that that was specifically more sleep disturbances in young adults. Those shifts were typically that people had less total sleep time, that they had sleep timing later on than they would normally go to bed, and that they also had this is for sleep regularity. It was just more irregular. So people, the way that this particular research was looking at it was just saying that people were sleeping at times that were not aligned with their particular chronotype. We also know that sleep specifically, or that COVID specifically impacted pre-sleep arousal, and that it also impacted mindfulness and self-compassion. So basically every major component that I was interested in studying was heavily impacted by COVID-19, including the psychopathology symptoms. One thing that felt fairly clear is that it could be that participants in the sample were just experiencing higher than normal psychopathology symptoms during this time frame because of the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, and that mindfulness and self-compassion were not quite the adequate buffer needed to address any of the stress from the pandemic as it relates to their sleep. COVID-19 aside, we also had other limitations in the study. One, mindfulness and self-compassion were still assessed through separate models technically. And future statistical modeling should look at these concepts more together. So specifically, maybe looking at them in mediation or moderation models. Sleep arousal was collected through self-report methods, and future studies should be looking at pre-sleep arousal through somatic methods, maybe by looking at cortisol, heart rate, blood pressure. Looking at state versus trait, we had a small component of state levels of mindfulness and self-compassion, but it might be more robust to do something like an EMA or an ecologic momentary assessment test in the future. And then also we just had equipment malfunction. So one of our limitations was that several of our watches would just on night one or two would stop working and we would lose a whole week of sleep data. So future research would probably buffer their proposed sample size to account for about 16% data loss from any equipment malfunctions. So why does this matter? Why is this still worth pursuing? Why is this a question we want to still kind of pull apart? One is that college students are still not getting adequate sleep. We know that this is really, really important for these major things I was talking about: well-being, social interactions, academic success, anxiety, depression, suicidal behaviors. Mindfulness and self-compassion are free internal resources. And these free internal resources are things that transcend socioeconomic status, they transcend education level. And so if we could figure out how exactly this is interacting with sleep health, we might be able to create interventions that could help a very, very large amount of people. So at this point, I just want to open it up for questions.
Typically, we open it up to audience members if anyone has questions, and then we'll move on to the.
So looking at your control group and the conclusions you've drawn, looking for that sort of magic bullet of applicable tools for practical use in subpopulations. If you were to design your next study based upon this current data, what would it look like? And what questions would you like to perhaps answer in that if you thought about that?
I mean, if I had unlimited resources, I would literally just run the study all the way over again in a population that wasn't experiencing a giant global pandemic. Like, I think above everything else, that was the thing that if these were strong enough relationships, right, like they would have emerged regardless of the pandemic. That is something that's probably true. However, I think that the nuance of the ways that they show up probably was masked by the pandemic. So if I had unlimited resources, I would maybe try to just do the whole thing over again. However, let's say I did find something, right? Let's say I did find that mindfulness or self-compassion did impact sleep health outcomes. I think something that I would want to do is probably my next research question around that particular desire to want to create interventions. I would probably look at which interventions are the most easy to elicit, which are like the most impactful for people that could be used right before bed during that pre-sleep arousal period. And then I would try to see if I could elicit that particular feeling or experience of mindfulness and self-compassion and see if that did in fact change their sleep health outcomes over the course of the week.
So if I can understand that it sounds like that because this research is so in its infant stages in terms of validation, larger number with a little bit more controlled environment globally, things you can't control like natural disasters and pandemics, might establish a better foundational correlation of these elements to then build upon.
It could be. Yeah, it could be. I think that, like I said at the beginning, the mindfulness literature is pretty mixed. The self-compassion literature is actually very clean. When they find stuff in self-compassion, it's typically there, but I've read a lot of mindfulness papers that some are like, it's there and it's a really strong effect, and some it's like, we ran basically the same study, didn't find anything. So it's, Kara and I had talked about perhaps that like maybe there's something within the subscales of the way they measure mindfulness that maybe it's something around like one of those particular subscales that is showing up.
These are really compelling questions
Yeah.
that impact a lot of different professions and vocations
Yeah.
that I think are helpful.
So something that I've researched a decent amount is the idea of, just say with counseling and therapy, the idea of mindfulness and compassion, and sort of counseling intervention being paired with medication, and seeing that that is like the most helpful sort of thing that we can put together. Did you do any research or look into it all, pairing these sort of mindfulness techniques with medication and sleep medication, and seeing where that went?
Yeah, I actually didn't look into that for this particular study just because I wasn't doing an intervention. So I wasn't, that was like more of a distracting rabbit hole than anything for me. I was trying to get this done. But it's an interesting question, because I think that my understanding from medication, and this isn't a body of literature I'm super familiar with, but is that if it is paired with other things, that it doesn't mean that sometimes outcomes are better for medication, and some of these non-medicating tools if they are used in conjunction for a short period of time. So people have sort of this alleviation, they can put other tools in place, and then they can theoretically like move through whatever period of depression or anxiety they're having. We know that in practical use, that's actually not how it shows up at all, but like that's how I have seen it talked about so far.
Sorry. Another question. When constructing trials, there's a constraint sometimes of IRB and also funding and availability of technological equipment. Did you find limitations in any of those realms that were barriers to perhaps a more ideal setup or question to be asked? Some of these matrix that you measured, need tools that.
No, I feel pretty lucky. Our lab is pretty stacked, and I got to borrow some of Mayha's school equipment too. And we worked with some things that I didn't talk about because it wasn't for this particular project, but that I do have is that this study actually looked at some of the things I recommended doing for the next study, right? So kind of set myself up a layup here, but so we actually did measure all of these things in the larger study. It was just too much data for me to do for my thesis. So when participants showed up at the beginning of the week, not only did they do a battery of tests with mindfulness and self-compassion, but I also looked at things like regular compassion. I looked at perceived stress. I looked at, I think I had people do the ACEs. I think I had people do, I think that was maybe all that showed up at the beginning. But when we sent them home to collect data over the course of the week, I actually had structured it as an ecologic momentary assessment study. So they were getting text messages 4 times a day, asking them a couple of these questions every single time they would get a text message. And in addition to answering some EMA data, they were also prompted to take their ambulatory blood pressure. And then the last 2 full nights of the study, they did cortisol sampling. So they did cortisol in the morning and then they did cortisol in the evening as well. So I had pretty limitless resources as it turns out.
So you have a lot of raw data
Yes.
somewhere.
Somewhere in the magical
Yeah,
ether of
yeah.
the cloud. Yeah, it's there.
How did you like recruit your participants?
Yeah, so we mostly recruited through a Sona pool. And this is actually a really important question that kind of ties into the limitations of this, right? Which is that this was a fairly historically stressful period of time. And so the participants who were signing up for these studies either were required to for their Psych 100 class, they needed a certain amount of credits to get that, or they were getting it for extra credit. And so students who were doing well enough at this point in the pandemic where everything, was like a snow globe that got shaken up, and they had enough resources to be showing up, to be doing a week's worth of data collection for themselves. There's probably some kind of selection bias about those particular people. Hard to say what that is exactly, but yeah, it's likely that we have some kind of third variable at play here.
You said 19 was the age.
Yeah, we cut it off at 25, so it was, we very specifically just wanted to look at young adults.
How about the challenges with this massive amount of data and recognizing patterns or things that we're going to be including, things to be excluded? What's the process for that? That's something that I'm not familiar with.
Oh, well, I bit off way more than I can chew, which is why this is taking me so long. Just to be totally frank about it. Yeah, I think that I learned a really valuable lesson about if I have a question to like love and trust that bigger question, right? But to try and figure out how to parse it down to its most simple component first. And then feel like I have a better command of like, how do I research this one tiny piece of it before adding on whatever this monster was. And it was good, right? It's like I learned a ton of different skills, but I think the upside to that too is that I actually have all these other questions that have emerged as I've been crunching this data, and I don't have to run another study. I have all that data. I just have to now learn how to deal with that data, which is exciting because in theory, I think that this one particular study, I could be crunching the data from this for the next decade and still have questions I could be sifting through. So.
I have a question about the that mindfulness and self-compassion were assessed through separate models, because I appreciated that you said, you know, it seems a little strange that they are typically assessed so separately because they are like inexorable. And I really care about the validity of how these things are assessed and the scales and the tools and how those are created. So I wonder if you have an idea about like what would it look like to assess them. Yeah. Would a new scale need to be created? Is there other existing scales that would do that? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I wish I had more like non-secular mindfulness and self-compassion practice before I had run this study. Because I think that like when I went and looked at the Dharma Center for 5 months, I had a much better understanding of how linked these two things were. And I actually think that the self-compassion scale just by itself would be a strong enough tool. But so actually, let me go back a couple pages. So the self-compassion scale has these 6 distinct subscales within it. And one of those subscales is mindfulness over identification. And so if you were looking at a very specific mindfulness question that had to do with like pulling apart different aspects of mindfulness, this wouldn't be a very useful scale. But if you were looking at how mindfulness and self-compassion work together within a research study, I think if you use this scale, but then very, very specifically pulled out each subscale to see how the ratio of how each subscale is interacting with each other, I think that might be giving some of the most, I wouldn't say maybe necessarily like scientifically precise, but I think for practitioners, if they found research using the scale that had subscales split out, might be most, most useful for practitioners to try and figure out like, how do I guide someone through this process?
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions from the virtual space, perhaps? I don't want to forget you. Let's see. Leah is asking, how do you see daytime sleeping and napping playing a role in my research? Yeah, this is a great question because in our sleep diaries, we did ask about naps. So I have that data in there, but it's not something that we like specifically accounted for necessarily. We didn't like pull anything out. We didn't have like a nap scale in here. During a particular time of this data collection too, during COVID, I'm sure people were just like taking more naps than normal. Like sleep was just so bizarre at this time. But in general, to answer your question, Leah, I think that that's a complicated question because I think that so much of sleep health like so many of the sleep health variables relate to each other, right? And so if you're not getting your total sleep time but at night, but you are getting some of that total sleep time implemented or supplemented from a nap during the day. I haven't looked into that data enough to know if that means more global, like that all the other things stay intact. So I think that's a great question to like parse through and see how napping pulls this in and out. I would guess, if I just had to throw a guess out there, that I'd be curious about people's levels of mindfulness and self-compassion before a nap, right? Because like our society is not really structured for naps. We are not a society that has like taking a little siesta in the middle of the day as being an acceptable thing. If we take naps as a culture, it's usually because we snuck under our desk somewhere and turned all the lights out and pretended that we're not home or we're not busy, right? And so in order for someone to give themselves the permission to take a nap, there might be something about people who are frequent nappers that might have more levels of mindfulness and self-compassion. Rachel asks, I wonder about the impact of community-based mindfulness and compassion interventions as compared to solo methods. I am so glad that you brought this up, Rachel, because in its culturally specific context, mindfulness and self-compassion is a community practice. You sit with a sangha, you go to meditation retreat, you practice regularly with other people, and you can practice on your own. But I do believe that there is something, if I had to guess, around some co-regulation that's happening in the room. There's just this concept of noble silence when you're specifically when you're on a silent retreat, where when you enter into noble silence, you get to drop all of your social expectations. You don't have to look people in the eye, you don't have to smile at people, you don't have to open doors. And it lets you really completely turn inward without being ostracized. You know, everyone's in the same space. Everyone is getting their meals taken care of for them. Everyone's sleeping in similar locations. And so there's sort of this inherent safety that like you don't get ostracized or taken away from community without having to interact with community. And so with something like this, like mindfulness and self-compassion in a solo method, I have questions and curiosities around if it's harder to access things like mindfulness and self-compassion when you are not in a built-in community setting. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, Rachel, but those are just some general thoughts of that. Liz, do you think by framing the study in a positive light is an easier path to get people to change their sleep habits? I hope so. That's like maybe an optimistic thing that is true or untrue. I think it depends on someone's personality. I think it depends on all sorts of things. But the reason I framed it in a positive psychology light is honestly probably just a bias that I have, that I think that so much historical research in psychology has come from this more negative variance view, and that I think when we ask different questions, even if they're inherently the same question, right? If I'm trying to get people to have different sleep habits, and one day I ask in a negative way of like, why aren't you getting sleep? What's wrong with your sleep? I'll get a certain level of question back. And if I ask that same, I'm getting at the same question of your sleep health, but I'm saying, what do you feel really good about in your sleep? What could you lean into more about how you feel about your sleep? It's not that one's right or one's wrong necessarily, but you get different answers to asking those questions in different ways. Depression nap, LOL. Katie, did you look at if people were sleeping alone or with other people and pets? Yes, we did ask that question. So in our sleep diary data, we do know, it's pretty well known that co-sleeping with people, we have, or when people have pets, those are two of some of the main biggest sleep disturbances people will have throughout the night. And so we did ask that. It's not something we co-varied for, but that data is there. So if we wanted to dig into that further, we could. Montana Mindfulness Project. I'm curious, given what you have found so far, if you would offer folks self-compassion phrases before sleep. As I mentioned to you, it's a peaceful state. Yes. Thank you, Margaret, for asking that. What I have found so far, I can't say that from this data, I couldn't conclusively say this is what I would recommend, right? Like for a couple of reasons. I'm not a clinical psychologist as being top one, but as a researcher, as someone who's curious about trying to increase sleep health, as someone who's has curiosities in this vein, I definitely have used them. I would, and I think that the ways that they might be most effective, actually, I love this subscale. And I think, so the person who does a lot of this research, which is Kristen Neff, she, I'll have to close this, would be pairing a different self-compassion phrase before bed with each one of these subscales, right? So if you're having a hard time because you're like, maybe you're having an elevated physiological response before bed because you're stressed because you and your partner got into a fight. And you look at this scale of isolation versus human connection, you can have self-compassionate phrases in two different ways. One could be, man, I'm recognizing in this moment that I'm feeling super alone before bed. And it's really hard to feel alone before bed. That would be a self-compassionate way to phrase that. And just by acknowledging that feeling, according to Kristen Neff and the way she frames self-compassion, that in and of itself might be a tool. That might be enough to assuage or just be with that pain in a different way. Another way would be to take this other more like positive variance piece of the self-compassion scale of human connection, which would be, man, I'm feeling really alone before bed right now. So many people go to bed feeling alone. I'm at least not alone and feel, like there is a universality to this, or I have felt alone like this before. And so if I were going to use it as a practical tool, and the ways that I have used it is by trying to kind of identify in what category am I feeling sleep disturbances out of the self-compassion scale, and then targeting that particular one. Hopefully that answers your question. And then Cody, is it possible to use this data for a larger study of the effects of COVID by comparing with pre and post-COVID sleep data? Cody, it's a great question. That is one of the reasons that I would want to run this whole study all the way over again, just to compare to see what would happen. There are other studies that are similar enough that use a lot of the scales that I use have been used in tons and tons of other research, specifically by other sleep researchers. So it is possible that I could use some of this data from COVID and compare it to other sleep data that has happened pre-COVID, or running one that's like post-COVID, but post-COVID several years. And that's more or less what I did in the limitation section. So if you remember this slide here, where is it? So this slide here, Cody, is basically doing exactly what you're asking about. So taking, these researchers did that legwork for me, where they were looking at sleep pre and post-COVID and looking at how that changed. And then I used their legwork to then inform my research on maybe how some of what I found might differ from if I had done this at a non-COVID time.
Last question. We'll move on.
Yeah, totally. Okay, I'm gonna answer one more question from Lisa and Jim, and then I'm gonna move on to the committee. Did you ask participants their sleep aid histories and ask them not to use them during the study? Yes, that's a great question, Lisa and Jim. So for the study, we actually did a full clinical sleep interview. And on that, it was very specific that people couldn't be on SSRIs. We asked about their sleep history. If anyone even looked like they were close to having some diagnosable sleep disorder, we excluded them from the study, just so that we were focusing primarily on, healthy sleepers in general.
Everyone, really good questions. So we'll ask everyone to step out, and it'll just be the
Thank you, all of you virtual humans, for being here and asking really great questions. I'm just going to be meeting with my committee now.